The gate number was wrong. I knew at the moment the boarding ramp sealed behind me and the smell hit. Something between burnt copper wire and the inside of a greenhouse, warm and alive, and absolutely nothing like the recycled hull plastic of the cargo freighter I was supposed to be on. But I was 3 minutes late. The corridor lights were already cycling to departure amber, and the alternative was standing in docking bay 7 of Halcyon Station, explaining to a very tired immigration officer why a human male traveling solo needed a second night in the transient quarters. So I kept walking. The corridor was narrower than a standard Union freighter, the ceiling maybe 10 centimeters lower than my head required, which meant I was doing the half-crouch shuffle that every human over 180 centimeters eventually perfects in deep space transit. The walls were pale gray with a faint green bioluminescent strip running along the baseboard rather than the ceiling, which gave everything a swamp-like quality, not unpleasant, just disorienting. Handholds were spaced wrong, too far apart for human arm reach, which told me something before I even saw another passenger. What I saw instead was a pair of eyes. They belonged to a figure standing at the junction of the corridor and what appeared to be a crew access ladder, and they were looking at me the way you look at a stray dog that has somehow appeared in your kitchen. The eyes themselves were amber with no visible white, the pupils wide and dark. The face was long and delicate, gray-green skin with faint darker striping along the jaw. Sheth, I thought, immediately, though I'd only seen them in station directories and one very bad holographic tourism advertisement. The Sheth were reclusive traders out of the Meridian Reach. Their ships were fast, their cargo manifests were always mysteriously incomplete, and their entire civilization had the social warmth of a deep-core mining probe. The one watching me was female. The striping pattern was wrong for a male, or so the station directory had informed me, and she was wearing a close-fitted suit of dark material with rank indicators I didn't recognize on the collar. She was holding something in one hand that might have been a tablet or might have been a weapon. With Sheth, you were never fully certain. "I may have taken the wrong ship," I said. The sentence came out conversational, which surprised me, given that my heart was doing something unpleasant behind my sternum. The amber eyes blinked slowly, once. "Human," she said in trade tongue, which at least meant we had a language. "Yes. This vessel is not registered for human transport." "I'm aware of that now. We departed docking bay 7 approximately 90 seconds ago." "I know." Another long pause. "You entered this ship." "I did. Intentionally." I weighed my options. No, but intentionally enough that I kept walking after I smelled the air, so I accept partial responsibility. She stared at me for another full 5 seconds. Then she did something I did not expect. She turned and went up the ladder and halfway up said without looking down, "Do not touch anything," and then was gone. I did not touch anything. The crew of the *Veth Charon, which I later learned translated roughly to needle between stars, which felt very on brand for a Sheth vessel, numbered 7. All female. All currently assembled in the forward crew lounge, which was itself roughly the size of a large closet, and all staring at me with the focused attention of people who were accustomed to no surprises in deep space, and were recalibrating that expectation in real time. The one who had found me in the corridor was the first mate. Her name, rendered in trade tongue phonetics, was something close to Sarah, a single-syllable tonal click that I was immediately told I was not pronouncing correctly and would probably never pronounce correctly given the limitations of human soft palate construction. She didn't seem offended. She seemed resigned. The captain was taller than Sarah by a head, the striping on her jaw broader and more complex, and she was looking at me the way a mathematician looks at an equation that has produced an obviously impossible output and is considering whether the universe has made a clerical error. Her trade tongue was better than Sarah's, precise and clipped, the kind you get from actual negotiation experience rather than machine translation. "You understand that we cannot return to Halcyon Station," she said. "I assumed not. What's your next port of call?" "Meridian Station, 18 days transit." "I can work for passage." The captain looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the captain. A conversation happened in this exchange that was entirely invisible to me but was clearly very full of content. "What can you do?" the captain said. "Mechanical systems, pressure seals, basic electrical repair, some navigation computation, though your systems are probably more advanced than anything I've trained on. General maintenance. I'm also reasonably useful in a crisis." The captain tilted her head. "You say this confidently." "I've had a lot of crises." "Most humans who end up on Sheth vessels," she said carefully, "do not end up on them by accident. Most humans who end up on Sheth vessels have been kidnapped, traded, or are smuggling something." I spread my hands, which I had read was a non-threatening gesture across most humanoid species, though with Sheth you were never entirely sure. "I'm an independent hull technician between contracts. I had a berth booked on a Union cargo hauler. The gate numbers on Halcyon Station are apparently subject to last-minute changes that the passenger notification system fails to communicate in any useful time frame." A longer silence. "Your name," said the captain. "Marcus Vell." "I am Keth." She said it as a statement, not an introduction, which I was slowly learning was simply how Sheth spoke. Everything was a statement. Uncertainty was something they dealt with internally, never out loud. "You will stay in the forward maintenance bay. You will not access crew quarters, navigation systems, or cargo holds without permission. If you attempt to access communication arrays to signal external parties, I will vent the bay." "Understood." "Do you require anything in the next 18 days that a Sheth vessel does not typically carry?" I thought about this honestly. Protein I can digest, water, somewhere to sleep that's longer than 160 centimeters. Keth looked at Sarah again. "We can accommodate most of this," said Sarah carefully, as if measuring the words for weight. "Then we're in agreement." Keth turned and walked away. The other 5 crew members, I hadn't caught all their names yet, though one of them, the engineer, was called Veth something long that also resolved into a click I couldn't make, continued to stare at me for a moment longer. Then the tallest one, who had the most complex striping of the group, and appeared to be approximately the age of someone who has seen too much and is no longer impressed by any of it, said something in Sheth tongue that I couldn't follow, and 3 of the others made a sound that I would only later understand was laughter. I was, as it happened, already the most interesting thing that had happened on the asterisk needle between stars in approximately 4 months. On the 3rd day, the engineer came to find me. Her name was Yiset. The full tonal version was well beyond me, but she accepted Yiset with the air of someone who had made peace with translation losses long ago. She was younger than the others, with wider eyes and a slightly greener skin tone that Sarah had explained, when I asked carefully, was simply individual variation rather than anything medical. Yiset had the focused energy of someone who loves machines the way other people love music, not possessively, but reverently, like every gear and seal and pressure valve had a personality she was personally acquainted with. She had come because one of the secondary coolant regulators in the starboard engine housing was producing a vibration signature she didn't like. "You said you could do mechanical systems," she said, standing at the entrance to my maintenance bay with a tablet extended toward me. The diagnostic readout on it was in Sheth notation, which I couldn't read, but vibration waveforms look like vibration waveforms across most notation systems, and I could see immediately what was bothering her. "Harmonic resonance in the second regulator housing," I said. "The frequency is too regular to be component wear. Something's misaligned." Yiset stared at me. "Yes," she said slowly. "How long has it been doing that?" 6 days. And before I got here, I could not determine the cause. I looked at the waveform again. The mounting bracket is probably twisted, maybe a quarter turn. It's not creating resonance internally, it's receiving resonance from an external source. Something else on the vessel is producing a vibration at this frequency, and the regulator housing is picking it up like an antenna. I looked up. Do you have a structural scan I can look at? Yiset's expression went through about 4 distinct phases in quick succession, ending somewhere around cautious wonder. You determined this from the waveform alone. I've fixed a lot of engines. She handed me the tablet. We spent 4 hours in the engine compartment, which was the warmest and most familiar-feeling space on the ship. Machines are machines regardless of who built them, and the smell of engine, lubricant, and electrical discharge has a comforting universality. Yiset worked with the efficiency of someone who knows her systems inside out, which meant she moved fast and precisely, and sometimes forgot to explain what she was doing before she did it. And I had to ask twice for her to slow down so I could understand what I was handing her. The source of the resonance turned out to be a loose thermal dampener panel 6 compartments forward, which had developed a microgap in its mounting foam and was vibrating at low amplitude with the ship's baseline drive frequency. We replaced the foam, retorqued the panel, and the waveform went flat. Yiset looked at the flat line for a long moment. How did you know it was external and not internal? She said. The waveform was too clean. Real component wear produces messy harmonics. A clean frequency like that is always resonance from something else. I paused. Also, your secondary regulators looked well maintained. You clearly take care of them. I didn't think you'd miss internal wear. She made the sound I now recognized as laughter, brief and low. You are trying to make me feel good about the diagnosis. I'm also being honest. Both can be true, said Yiset, which was the most philosophically open thing I had heard any chef say in 3 days, and I marked it as significant. By the 5th day, a sort of equilibrium had developed. Yiset came to find me every morning with whatever minor engineering problem she'd been sitting with overnight, and we would go fix it together, and then she would go back to her station, and I would go back to the maintenance bay and the quiet rhythm of a long transit. This had become a ritual neither of us had formally agreed to. It had simply grown the way good things sometimes do, by repetition and mutual willingness. By the 4th morning it was expected. By the 5th it was necessary. The problems she brought were not always serious. On the 4th day, it was a recalibration of the atmospheric scrubber in Section 3 that was technically within tolerance but producing a faint sulfur note she didn't like. On the 5th, it was a door seal in cargo that had developed a soft click on cycling that she suspected meant the gasket was beginning to compress unevenly. These were the small problems, the ones that do not threaten anything but indicate, if you ignore them long enough, the kind of deeper issues that will eventually threaten everything. Yiset did not ignore small problems, which told me something important about who she was. We had developed a language for the work. Not words exactly, more like a timing, a shared sense of when to speak and when to simply hand over the next tool. She would describe the problem in trade tongue with technical precision, and I would listen until she finished, and then we would go look at it together. She never handed me a job and walked away. She was always there, present and attentive, the way a person is present when they consider the work genuinely shared. Once, on the 6th morning, I arrived at the maintenance bay before she did, and she appeared 3 minutes later with a container of something warm and placed it on the bench beside me without comment. It was a chef beverage that I had tried once before and which tasted, in my honest estimation, like someone had steeped a pine branch in mineral water. I drank it anyway, because she had brought it and said nothing about the taste. She noticed, she always noticed. "You do not like it," she said. "I don't mind it. That is different from liking it." "It's warm," I said. "That's the important part." Yiset looked at me for a moment with the focused expression that preceded insight. Then she went to the food preparation area and came back with a different container, which turned out to be a Sheth grain-based drink that was very slightly sweet and tasted considerably better. "Try this," she said. I tried it. "This is good, actually." She made the laughter sound. "It is the simplest thing we make. I did not offer it first because I assumed you would find it too plain." "Plain things are underrated," I said. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most statements that were not obviously jokes. "Plain means uncomplicated," she said, "not unworthy." "Exactly. Humans value complexity," she said, not critically but observationally. "Some humans, some of the time." I looked at the beverage. "The ones I've respected most usually had a preference for the simplest solution that actually worked." Yiset absorbed this. "My mentor at the engineering academy," she said after a moment, "used to say that a beautiful engine is one with no unnecessary parts, not a complicated engine, a correct one." Your mentor sounds like someone worth knowing. She was very old and very strange, and she could hear engine problems that the diagnostics missed by 40 minutes. Yiset looked at the engine compartment doorway with a particular expression I was learning to read as affection filtered through Sheth Reserve. She said the diagnostics measure what has already happened. The ear hears what is about to happen. Is that why you don't entirely trust the readouts? She looked at me sharply. I trust the readouts. You check them twice, I said, every time, and then you listen. A pause, yes. That's not distrust, I said, that's competence. The warm, focused silence that followed this was one of the better silences I'd sat in recently, and I had been in some good ones. Two of the other crew, the one with the complex striping, whose name approximated to Vane, and a quieter one who handled cargo and navigation called Orcs, had begun speaking to me at mealtimes. Not extensively, but with the particular quality of people who are genuinely curious and are attempting to conceal this from themselves. The Sheth, it turned out, ate 4 small meals per day rather than 3 larger ones, and they had no real custom around communal eating. The crew lounge had a food preparation area, and everyone accessed it when they needed to. But I ate at the same time as whoever happened to be there, because the alternative was eating alone in the maintenance bay with nothing to look at except pressure seals, and on a long transit, solitude becomes a resource you have to manage carefully. It was Vane who first asked me the question. She was the oldest member of the crew after Keth, and she had the kind of quietness that is not shyness, but is instead something closer to patience. The sense of someone who has found that waiting is always faster than rushing. She asked it not with any particular preamble, simply setting down her food container and looking at me with those amber eyes and saying, in trade tongue that had a slightly formal quality that suggested this was a considered question. How do human males select their mates? I had been in the process of eating something that had the texture of dense flatbread and tasted faintly of mineral water and anise. I chewed, swallowed. That's a wide question. Narrow it as you prefer. Well, generally, both parties express interest. There's usually some period of sustained interaction, shared experience, conversation. I paused. And then one or both parties formally indicates that they'd like to be together in a more lasting way. Vane considered this. Both parties? Ideally, yes. In Sheth tradition, she said, the female selects the male. He has no voice in the selection. Once she has declared, the bond is assumed to exist. That seems like it might produce some complicated situations. It does, she tilted her head. Do human males require convincing? Sometimes. I think most people of most species require some degree of convincing at various points. Orcs, who had been pretending to look at something on a tablet at the far end of the lounge, said, without looking up, Is it true that human males can sustain continuous physical activity for longer than most other humanoid species? I looked at her. She looked at her tablet. Endurance running, yes, I said carefully. Humans are among the better distance-capable species on the biological spectrum. I'm not sure what context you're asking in. Physical activity, said Oris very neutrally. In what domain? Oris put her tablet down and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has decided that the indirect approach is not working. Is it true, she said, that human males can sustain coupling for an extended duration compared to Sheth males? I looked at Vane. Vane looked at the ceiling. I genuinely don't know how Sheth males compare, I said. I don't have reference data. Sheth males, said Oris, average approximately 4 minutes before conclusion. I said. There are accounts, said Oris, in navigational exchange records second and third hand, but consistent, that suggest human males average considerably longer. Navigational exchange records, I said. I'm sorry. Trade routes cross many populations, said Vane, examining a point on the ceiling with professional interest. Information is exchanged. This is known. What the accounts say, continued Oris, who had apparently decided to lean into this fully, is that human males average between 17 and 45 minutes, depending on individual variation. I considered several possible responses. The accounts, I said, are not inaccurate. The quality of the silence that followed was remarkable. Yiset, who had appeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds earlier and had been very still, said quietly, in Sheth, something I couldn't follow, and Vane replied in Sheth with something that was apparently very funny because both Oris and Yiset made the laughter sound simultaneously, and Vane herself allowed a small, very controlled smile. I ate my flatbread in a silence that was, at minimum, very warm. The cultural clarification came from Sarah, who appeared at my maintenance bay on the 6th morning with the expression of someone who has been assigned an unpleasant administrative task and is approaching it with professional efficiency. The crew is curious about you, she said. I've noticed. Among the Sheth, a single male traveling with an all-female crew would, in traditional convention, be considered to be traveling under their protection, as their male. I absorbed this, their male. Temporarily, said Sarah quickly, in the sense of the crew takes responsibility for him. In the context of deep transit, this carries certain ceremonial implications. What kind of ceremonial implications? The ceremony of first offering, said Sarah, with the exhausted precision of someone reading from a text they wish they hadn't been asked to read from, involves the senior females of the traveling party presenting themselves to the protected male, dressed in the formal vestments of Sheth tradition, as an expression of. Sarah. Yes. What are the formal vestments of Sheth tradition? The pause was about 2 seconds. The vestments of Sheth tradition, she said, are ceremonial in nature and are considered highly formal and deeply dignified. And in terms of coverage, they are minimal, said Sarah, relative to transit wear. I looked at her. How minimal? The formality, she said carefully, is in the ritual structure and the language spoken, not in the garments themselves. So we're talking about. We are talking, said Sarah firmly, about an ancient and highly respected Sheth tradition of acknowledging a protected traveler's status, expressed through formal ceremonial dress that has deep cultural significance, and absolutely is not intended to be. You're going to take your clothes off, I said. We are going to present ourselves in ceremonial vestments, said Sarah, which are, yes, traditionally, minimal, in there. How many of you? Another pause. Tradition requires the senior officers, Captain Keth has indicated she will observe rather than participate. How many officers? 4. I sat with this for a moment. Sarah, I said. Yes. Is this something the crew actually wants to do, or is this something that tradition says they have to do? The question appeared to require processing. Both are true simultaneously, she said finally. Sheth do not separate wanting from obligation in the way that humans appear to. The tradition exists because the impulse existed first. And the impulse in this case is. You fixed the resonance problem, said Sarah with great dignity. That Yisset had been losing sleep over for 6 days. You eat meals with people without being asked to. You ask names before you use them. You did not, when you found yourself alone on a Sheth vessel with no legal status and no witnesses, take any advantage of that situation. Those seem like fairly baseline behaviors, I said. Sarah looked at me steadily. For humans, perhaps, we have carried human males on this vessel before as cargo under other circumstances. This is not how they behaved. She straightened slightly. You will, of course, have the option to decline the ceremony. No tradition requires acceptance. If I decline, then nothing changes. You continue as you are. We dock at Meridian Station in 12 days, and we file the appropriate immigration documentation, and you go on with your life. And if I accept, then the crew formally acknowledges you as their protected male for the duration of transit. She paused. In Sheth tradition, this carries certain subsequent obligations of reciprocity, which are, you would be expected to take each of the 4 officers to dinner. I stared at her. That's it. There are ceremonial words spoken at dinner, Sarah added, that are traditionally very long and somewhat repetitive, and the dinner itself lasts approximately 6 hours because Sheth etiquette requires 4 additional courses be offered even if the participant is full, so there is a physical endurance component. I'll accept the ceremony, I said. Sarah blinked, both eyes simultaneously, which I was learning was the Sheth equivalent of visible surprise. You should know, she said, that there are no subsequent obligations of a. Sarah, I understand. I appreciate the tradition. Tell the crew I'm honored. She looked at me for a long moment. You genuinely mean that, she said. I do. Why? The question seemed to arrive before she intended it to, and she made a small movement that suggested mild embarrassment. Because you're all treating a stray human who stumbled onto your ship with more ceremony and more consideration than most species would. I paused. Also, Yisset has been kind to me all week, and I've been trying to find a way to be kind back, and it seems like this is a way to do that without overstepping. Sarah turned to leave, then stopped. Marcus Vell. Yes. You are, she said carefully, a very unusual human. I've heard that before. It was not intended as criticism before either, she said, and went back up the corridor. The ceremony was on the 7th evening. I'd been given the forward observation deck, a small bubble of reinforced transparasteel at the ship's nose, with an unobstructed view of nothing but the deep between stars, which was probably the most beautiful room on the vessel even at its sparsest. The Sheth apparently used it for navigational meditation, which meant it was clean and very quiet and lit with only the bioluminescent strips set to their lowest output, giving everything the quality of early morning before dawn. I sat on the low bench they had placed there and waited. The 4 of them came in order of rank, Sarah first, then Vane, then Orcs, then Yisset, and Sarah had been accurate in her description of the vestments. They were strips of pale gray fabric wound in a formal geometric pattern that left their gray-green arms and shoulders, and most of their striped backs bare. And the pattern was clearly complex, and clearly intentional, and clearly carried meaning. On Earth, I thought, you'd be looking at this and thinking about what the ancient version of this ceremony looked like, and what it had meant to the people who first performed it, because this was not something invented recently. This was old, and it had the texture of old things, layered and dense with repeated use. Each of them spoke, in turn, in Sheth tongue, directed at me, and I didn't understand the words, but I understood the structure. Formal and considered, not rote. The way the words of someone who has chosen something are different from the words of someone performing a script. Sarah had given me beforehand a short phrasing I could say in response, a phonetic approximation of the Sheth acknowledgement, which I had practiced in the maintenance bay until I could produce something that did not sound like a mechanical failure. When Yiset spoke her portion, the youngest and therefore the least formal, something in her tone shifted slightly from the register of the others. It was warmer, more personal, and I didn't need Sheth to hear the difference. She was thanking me specifically, not as a protected male but as Marcus, and I looked at her and said the Sheth acknowledgement phrase and then added, in trade tongue, "The pleasure of working beside someone who loves what she does is its own gift. I should be thanking you." The silence after this was different from the earlier silence. Sarah later told me, over the first of what became 4 ceremonial dinners, that Yiset had cried very briefly after leaving the observation deck. Not from sadness. The Sheth, she explained, cried from something closer to the experience of being unexpectedly and precisely seen, not surprise, but recognition. "Humans call this being moved," I said. "We call it the knife recognition," said Sarah. "When something cuts exactly to the truth of you." That's a beautiful way to say it. "You can use it," said Sarah, with the most gracious expression I'd yet seen on her face, which was not effusive but was genuinely warm. "Humans may have it. We have enough." The dinners themselves were an education. The first was with Sarah, who had organized the whole ceremony and approached the dinner with the same efficient formality she brought to every professional obligation. Everything in the correct order, the ceremonial words spoken precisely, the 4 additional courses offered even though neither of us could eat much by the third. But halfway through the second course, something in her posture shifted, and she stopped performing the dinner and started simply being in it. "How long have you been working alone?" she asked, in a tone that was not ceremonial. "4 years, since my last long-term contract ended." "You chose this?" "Mostly." I looked at my food. "After my father died, I didn't want to be responsible for a crew. I thought moving solo was simpler." Sarah considered this for a long time. "That is not simpler," she said finally. "That is lonelier. Those are not always different things." She looked at me steadily, and I had the sense that she was filing this information somewhere internal, the way meticulous people file things not to use it, but to understand it correctly. "You do not appear lonely," she said. "I'm very good at it," I said. Something shifted in her expression, not pity, which I would not have welcomed, but the particular recognition of one competent person for another's competence in an unexpected domain. "You are," she said, "demonstrably very good at many things." The second dinner was with Vane, who was the most architecturally interesting conversationalist I had encountered in years. She spoke in long arcs, beginning at a point that seemed unrelated to wherever she was going and arriving at her actual meaning, by an approach that felt, in retrospect, inevitable. She told me about the history of the asterisk needle between stars, how Keth had captained it for 11 years, how the ship had been in Keth's family for generations, how a Sheth vessel was not a possession but more like an obligation, a living thing you were temporarily responsible for. "She feels it," said Vane, meaning Keth. "Every vibration the ship makes, the way you felt Yiset's resonance problem before you ever saw the diagnostic." "Familiarity," I said. "You learn the sounds things make when they're happy." Vane smiled. It was small, the Sheth smile, more in the eyes than the mouth. "That is exactly what Keth would say," she said, "if she were the type of person who said things directly." "She says things directly." "She says professional things directly," said Vane. "Personal things she says with the ship. When she flies her best, she is telling you something." I thought about the approach to the debris field. The way Keth had moved the ship at the mid-course correction. No hesitation. 4 degrees to starboard before Oris had fully finished the word, like she'd felt it coming before it was spoken. She loves it, I said. Extravagantly, said Vane with private amusement. Don't tell her I said so. The third dinner was Oris, who was the most technically minded of the crew outside of Yisset, and who spent the ceremonial portion in polite compliance, and then the remainder asking me detailed questions about human navigational techniques, Union vessel engineering, and what I thought of Sheth drive technology relative to the standard Union models. It was, genuinely, the most satisfying technical conversation I'd had in months, and somewhere around the 3rd hour I realized we'd stopped having a dinner and started having a working session, which seemed to suit Oris perfectly and suited me fine as well. You should work on a vessel that crosses both territories, she said at the end. Human registered, Sheth route access, you would be very useful. I don't know that such a route exists. It doesn't yet, said Oris, with the particular serenity of someone who has already modeled a future and found it sound. Things that should exist tend to eventually. The 4th dinner was Yisset, who was the least ceremonial about the ceremony. She sat down, said the formal words with the careful pronunciation of someone who takes language seriously, and then looked at me across the table with wide amber eyes and said simply, "Tell me something about where you come from." So I told her about Earth. Not the diplomatic version, not the species profile version, the actual one. The way the light falls differently at different latitudes, and how if you are from a cold country and you travel to a warm one for the first time you feel the sun differently than people who grew up under it. Almost grateful, in a physical way, as if your skin is finally receiving something it was always waiting for. I told her about the ocean, which Sheth don't have, and how the ocean is not one thing but many, cold and gray and violent in winter and flat and silver in early morning when the wind drops off. I told her about my father's house, which was near enough to the coast that you could hear the water at night if the wind was right. Yisset listened with the focused attention she gave to things that interested her, which was the most flattering kind of attention because it was unself-conscious and entirely real. "You miss it," she said. "Sometimes. But you chose space." "My father went to space," I said, "and I wanted to understand why he loved it enough to leave the ocean for it." I paused. "I think I understand now." "What was the reason?" "It's always moving," I said, "space. Every time you look at it from a different point, it's a different picture. The ocean does that too, but you're standing on the beach. Out here, you're inside the picture." Yisset looked at me with the knife recognition starting in her eyes, very faint, and then she looked down at her food and said, quietly, "Yes, that is exactly it." We sat in the observation bubble after the dinner was formally ended, looking at the stars going past at transit speed, and neither of us said much. The silence had the texture of the good kind, the kind between people who have run out of things to explain and are comfortable enough to be quiet together. It was, I realized, the best dinner I had had in a very long time. The crisis announced itself on the morning of the 11th day. I was in the engine compartment with Yisset. We had fallen into the habit of running a systems check together before the crew ate the first meal of the day, which meant I was usually the first or second person she saw each morning, and she had stopped looking mildly startled at my presence, which felt like a meaningful development, when the ship's alert tone sounded. Not the full alarm, which I'd asked about on day 2 and had been told sounded like a sustained high tone, and which I had never heard. This was the navigation alert, a short 2-tone pulse that meant something had changed about where they were going. I looked at Yisset. Yisset looked at her diagnostic screen, and her expression changed in a way I had not yet seen on her face. The focused intensity that replaced every other expression when she was solving a problem shifted and became something flatter and more careful. She said something in Sheth, not to me, that had the quality of a word you say when you don't want to say the word you're actually thinking. What? I said. Debris field, she said. Navigation has detected a debris field across our transit lane. Projected density is significant. How significant? She showed me the screen. The cloud of contacts was roughly ellipsoidal, roughly 300,000 kilometers across its short axis, and sat directly across the path between here and Meridian Station. Can we go around? I said. The mass shadow of the secondary star in this system constrains the transit options significantly. The edges of the cloud are within 200,000 kilometers of the gravity boundary. She paused. The captain will go around. It will add 4 days. I looked at the density map. Something about the distribution pattern was bothering me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate, but it had the particular quality of wrongness I'd learned to pay attention to in 12 years of whole work, not dramatic wrongness, the quiet kind, the kind that precedes the call at 3 in the morning. What is the debris? I said. The scan shows mass distribution consistent with large metallic fragments. How old? Yisset tapped the tablet. Age estimation is, she stopped, tapped again. Marcus. Age estimation on the metallic fragments is showing less than 70 hours. I looked at the screen. That's a wreck, I said. That's a recent wreck. Yes. Is there a vessel registry match? Another tap. Yisset's face had gone very still. One contact, she said quietly. Approximately 40 kilometers inside the debris field boundary. Mass and profile consistent with a Sheth vessel, Class 4 freighter. She looked up at me. There is a very faint electromagnetic emission from the contact. I was already moving toward the ladder to the upper deck. Marcus. Someone is alive in there, I said. Tell the captain. Keth had already seen the scan. The forward deck was arranged differently now, with the crew at their positions and the main display showing the debris field in full. A ragged cloud of tumbling metal and composite, and at its center left, the faint blip of the surviving contact. The emission was irregular, a distress beacon running on emergency power or something close to it. We have identified the vessel, said Keth, without preamble when I reached the deck. It is registered to a Sheth family trading concern out of Meridian Station. The crew manifest lists 9. Is the debris pattern consistent with an attack or an accident? I said. Consistent with impact, said Keth. A large mass object, likely a rogue body that was not present in the navigational charts for this transit lane. How many of the 9 could still be alive? Unknown. The emission signature is consistent with emergency life support, but the signal strength suggests significant hull damage. If we go in for rescue, said Sarah, we risk damage to our own hull. The debris density near the surviving contact is highest, said Orcs, from the navigation station. The path to that vessel goes through the densest sector of the field. I looked at the display. The path in was roughly 90 kilometers, through a corridor of debris that ranged from dust-sized fragments to pieces that could punch through hull plating. Any ship going in would be taking hits. The question was whether those hits would be survivable. What's your hull rating? I said to Keth. Class 5 composite, sufficient for minor impact loading. 50-gram fragments at relative velocity. Yisset answered from behind me. The hull can absorb 20 to 30 such impacts before we risk penetration in the vulnerable sections. And how many impacts can we expect on the path to the contact? Orcs pulled the model. At current debris density and our approach velocity, minimum 60, likely substantially more. Silence settled over the forward deck. We can't go straight in at speed, I said, but we don't have to. Keth looked at me. The debris is all in ballistic trajectory, I said. It's not going anywhere with purpose, it's just falling through the same space we are. If we can model the trajectories of the major fragments, We can thread a path that gets most of the dangerous impacts out of our way. I moved to the navigation display without asking permission, which I noticed Oris noting, but she didn't stop me. The big pieces are easy to avoid because they're big enough to track. The dust-sized fragments we can't avoid anyway, and at that mass, they won't penetrate. What's going to kill us is the mid-range material. Call it 50 grams to 5 kilograms. The mid-range material is the most numerous, said Oris. But it's also all on ballistic arcs. Nothing in this field has propulsion. Every fragment is moving in a straight line. If your scan resolution is good enough to track the major pieces, we can use their shadows, the areas of the field that larger fragments are sweeping clear in their wake. Oris looked at her screen. The model would require significant computation and someone at navigation with good instincts who can update the path in real time when the model diverges from reality. I looked at Oris, which I think you can do. Oris looked at the screen, then at Keth. The approach velocity would need to be low, said Keth. Threading requires time to react. Low approach velocity, yes, which means we're in the field longer, which is why the path modeling has to be right before we enter. I paused. Captain, 9 people, at least some of them are still alive. The window on emergency life support at that signature strength is, I looked at Yiset. 14 to 20 hours, she said, if the hull breach is what the signature suggests. So we have time to do this carefully, I said, if we do it carefully. Keth was quiet for a very long time. The kind of quiet that is not absence of thought but is thought happening at a density that excludes speaking. Oris, she said finally, begin the trajectory model. Yiset, I want structural integrity updated on all hull sections. Vane, prepare the medical bay for up to 9 casualties, assume trauma. She looked at me. You will assist in navigation computation. Understood. If the model shows the path is not survivable, we do not go in. Agreed. If we go in and take more damage than we can absorb, we may not come back out. I know. Why, said Keth very quietly, are you helping us with this? I looked at her. 9 people, I said. Some of them are probably not much older than Yiset. It was not a complicated answer. I watched it land on Keth the way simple things sometimes land on people who have become accustomed to complicated ones. Begin the model, she said. We spent 3 hours on the trajectory calculation. Oris was good, better than good. She was the kind of navigator who builds a picture of moving space in her head and can update it faster than the screen can render. And she and I fell into a working language that was mostly numbers and cardinal directions, and the word hold, which transcends most species when you need someone to pause before they commit. Yiset ran structural checks in parallel, calling updated readings to Sarah, who was logging them against damage thresholds. The path we found was not elegant. It went in at a 15-degree angle to the most obvious approach, using the shadow of a tumbling piece of hull plating roughly 4 meters across that was sweeping a corridor ahead of us. And then it made a course correction of about 22 degrees at the midpoint that was going to require Keth to read the display and adjust manually, because no automated system had the response time. The final approach to the surviving contact was the cleanest part. The wreck itself had swept a small, clear zone around it in the hours since the impact, and if we came in from the right angle, we'd be in near-clear space for the last 11 kilometers. Oris ran the damage projection on the path twice. The result was 11 to 16 significant impacts, plus a distributed load of fine-grade debris that would stress the hull but stay within rated tolerance. We looked at each other across the navigation station. That's a path, she said, in trade tongue, with the particular quality of someone saying something they hadn't expected to be able to say. That's a path, I agreed. Keth took us in at 40 kilometers per hour, which felt criminally slow, but was the right call. We needed reaction time, and the field needed to be predictable. The first impact came at the field boundary, a fragment the size of a melon that hit the port hull with a sound like a struck bell, and made everyone on the forward deck tighten their grip on their stations. Orcs called the first adjustment, 4 degrees to starboard, and Keth moved the ship before the word was fully out of Orris's mouth. I watched the shadow of the large plate ahead of us, tracking its arc across the field. The plate is going to drift north of our current heading in about 90 seconds, I said. We'll need to match the drift. Tracking, said Orris. 3 more impacts in the next 8 minutes, each one announcing itself like a fist hitting the hull from outside. The fourth was heavier and made the lights flicker, and Yisset said something short and terse from the engineering station, and then, hull integrity holding, 2 seconds later. The mid-course correction was the hardest part. We lost the plate's shadow for 40 seconds while Keth turned the ship and picked up the new line, and in those 40 seconds we took 4 hits in rapid sequence. The last one significant enough that Yisset went briefly silent and then said, "Port secondary hull section. Localized stress fracture within rated parameters. Do not exceed current speed." Then we were through. The surviving vessel was ahead of us, sitting in its self-cleared space like something that had given up trying to move and had simply decided to endure. The hull was badly breached on the port side, 2 sections completely open to space, sealed by emergency bulkhead systems that were holding but wouldn't hold much longer. The distress beacon was still going. "Docking approach," said Keth, and there was something in her voice that I'd not heard before, not relief, but its close cousin, the feeling of having done the right thing in time. 7 survivors, 2 in critical condition, 5 injured to varying degrees. We brought them all aboard. The medical bay had been prepared perfectly. Vane and Sarah moved through it with the efficiency of people who had done difficult things before, and understood that efficiency in this moment was the kindest thing they could offer. I helped carry the 2 critical cases because I was large enough to manage the weight and the Sheth crew were not, and I held the hand of one of them, a young one, barely past adolescence, disoriented and frightened in the particular way of someone who does not know if the danger has passed, and told her in trade tongue that she was safe. The ship was solid, and the people around her knew what they were doing. She held on until Vane indicated she was stable, and then she let go. The path out was easier. We knew the field now, Orris had the trajectories in her head, and we went out faster than we'd gone in. 3 impacts, all minor. When we cleared the field boundary and the debris was behind us, Keth took her hands off the navigation panel, looked forward at the stars, and stood there for a moment that I recognized as one of those moments a person allows themselves when no one is watching. Except I was watching, but I was a human, and Sheth do not appear to have the same reflexive self-consciousness about being seen in private moments. "We were 11 days out of Meridian Station," she said, mostly to herself. "Now we're 15, I said. "Yes. 7 people who would have died in 14 hours are going to reach Meridian Station instead." Keth turned and looked at me. "The path model," she said. "You were certain it would work." "I was confident," I said. "Certain is a different thing." "You did not sound uncertain." "Uncertainty on the forward deck does not serve the mission," I said. "There's a time for honest doubt and a time for clear action. When the model said the path was survivable, clear action was what we needed." Keth was quiet for a moment. "You have done this before, entered a dangerous space to bring someone out." "Several times." "Why?" I thought about how to answer this honestly. My father was a search and rescue technician. He used to say that every rescue operation is just time management. You figure out how long someone has, and you work backwards from that, and every decision you make is in service of the gap between the clock and the rescue. I paused. He also said the most dangerous thing about a rescue operation is when someone gets so focused on the risk to themselves that they lose track of whose time they're actually managing. "He sounds wise." "He was," I looked at the stars. He died on a rescue operation, hull failure on a salvage dive 6 years ago. The silence had a different texture now. I am sorry, said Keth, with the formality that I had learned in 11 days was not distance but respect. The Sheth hold grief as a private territory and acknowledge it with formality to indicate they understand it belongs to you. Thank you, I said. The remaining 4 days to Meridian Station were different. The 7 survivors were recovering, 2 slowly, 5 steadily, and the needle between stars was quieter than usual with the additional bodies, and also somehow less quiet. The way a space is different when it is holding people in need. Yiset had set up a monitoring station in the medical bay and was rotating checks with Vane every 6 hours. I sat with the young survivor, the near-adolescent, during one of my overnight watches. Her name translated roughly as Isin. She was old enough to have a full work role on the family freighter and young enough that the gap between what had happened to her and what she understood about it was still being measured. She asked me questions. What was I? Where was I from? How did I end up on this ship? I told her the story of the wrong boarding gate, which she found very funny. The Sheth laughter at 16 years, I discovered, is considerably less restrained than adult Sheth laughter. It sounds like water. You just walked onto the wrong ship, she said. In my defense, the gate numbers were confusing. And then you stayed. The alternative was standing in docking bay 7. No, she said, with the sharpness of someone who has just had a disaster and has not yet lost the ability to see clearly because of it. I mean you stayed. When the debris field you stayed. You helped. I looked at her. Someone had to. The others, the ones who didn't come. There were no others, I said gently. We were the only vessel in range. She absorbed this. So if you had not taken the wrong ship, then a different set of circumstances would have applied, I said, and I can't reason clearly about them because they didn't happen. Isin was quiet for a moment. My mother is one of the critical ones, she said. I know. Vane says she will recover. Vane does not tell people things to make them feel better, I said. She tells people things because they are true. Isin looked at me with amber eyes that were younger and less defended than any Sheth eyes I had seen in 2 weeks. You seem very certain about Vane. I've spent 12 days watching her, I said. I trust what I've learned. She considered this. Then she said, in the same tone as someone who is saying something they have decided needs to be said, when I am old enough, I want a crew on a vessel like this one. A Sheth vessel. One where humans are welcome. I looked at her for a long moment. Everywhere should be a place where humans are welcome, I said, and everywhere should be a place where Sheth are welcome, and everywhere else. That should just be the baseline. It is not always the baseline. No, I said, it's not, but it should be, and the gap between what is and what should be is where all the work happens. Isin thought about this. Outside the viewport, the stars were moving very slowly past, the way stars do when you are close enough to your destination that the journey is beginning to have an end. What work do you do, she said, when you're not on the wrong ship? I fix things, I said. Is that all? I thought about the debris field, about the trajectory model, about 7 people in a damaged ship running on emergency power, and the 14 to 20-hour window, and the path we'd threaded at 40 kilometers per hour while the hull took 11 hits and held. Sometimes, I said, I fix things that aren't exactly machines. Meridian Station appeared as a point of light on the 3rd morning after the debris field, and was a visible structure by midday. A Sheth station, all sweeping curves and bioluminescent panels, elegant in the particular way that things designed by people who do not separate beauty from function tend to be. The 2 critical survivors had been stabilized and were cleared for disembarkation to medical facilities. The other 5 were mobile and, in Isin's case, considerably more interested in the ship's operations than anyone had expected, which Orcs had addressed by giving her a running commentary of the docking approach. The survivor's family registered formally with the station and came aboard. There was a reunion that I watched from the periphery of the airlock corridor, which had the texture of private things and which I did not approach. Keth found me at the maintenance bay, where I was packing my kit, which was not much, a duffel bag of tools and 3 changes of clothes and a data pad, with the systematic efficiency of someone who has gotten very good at transitioning between vessels. The station has been informed of the debris field and the impact event, she said. The families of the survivors have asked that the crew of the *Veth Charon be formally recognized. The crew managed a difficult rescue very well, I said. Orcs's trajectory work was the key to it. You built the model. We built it together. Keth looked at me with the expression I had come to think of as her thinking out loud face, the one she wore when she was deciding to say something rather than keep it. The station's immigration officer will want to speak with you regarding your transit documentation, she said. You entered Sheth-registered space aboard a Sheth vessel without authorization, and the process for resolving this is somewhat involved. I expected that. The ship's log, she said, will indicate that you were engaged as emergency hull and navigation support personnel for the duration of transit, contracted at the time of departure. I looked at her. The compensation rate for emergency contract personnel, she continued, has been set to cover your transit to whatever your original destination was. Geth. The family of the survivors has contributed to this compensation as a gesture of formal gratitude, she said, with the tone of someone reading from a document that is entirely in order and need not be questioned. The immigration documentation will reflect a legitimate contract transit, which is substantially simpler than explaining an unauthorized boarding. You're doing paperwork to protect me, I said. We are correcting administrative records to accurately reflect the labor performed, she said, which was the most exact sentence I had heard in 18 days. I looked at her for a long moment. Thank you. You helped my crew fix an engine, she said. You helped my crew rescue 7 lives. You sat up overnight with a frightened young Sheth and told her the truth about her mother. She paused. The paperwork is not a significant gesture. It is to me, I said. Keth made a small motion, something I hadn't seen before, a brief inclination of the head that Sarah had mentioned, once, in passing, as the Sheth form of acknowledgement between equals. Sarah will escort you to the immigration desk, she said. When you have your next berth booked, I hope the gate number is correct. I hope so too, I said, though the wrong gate has occasionally led to good things. The expression on Keth's face was small and precise, and entirely deliberate. Occasionally, she agreed, and went back to her captain's work. I was in the immigration processing area, a sterile room that smelled of filtered air and bureaucratic patience, when Yiset found me. She had a tablet in her hand and her focused expression, which by now I could read clearly enough to know was covering something more than focus. Your transit compensation has been filed, she said. You should receive the transfer within 1 standard day. I know, Sarah walked me through it. Your next berth is to Kepler Station. I have a whole contract there. It's 10 days out. Yiset looked at the tablet. We transit through Kepler Station on our outbound leg, she said, very carefully, after Meridian. The *Veth Charon will be docked here for 6 days for resupply and maintenance. I looked at her. If your contract berth has not departed, she said, the gate number at Meridian Station is very clearly marked. It is, I agreed. But if one were not paying sufficient attention, she said, with the quality of someone working through a hypothetical, one might not catch the departure in time. I looked at Yiset. She looked at her tablet. The secondary regulator housing, I said, is going to develop that resonance again if the mounting foam on the thermal dampener panel isn't rechecked. I noticed it was borderline when we replaced it. Yisette looked up. You noticed this? I was going to mention it before I left. It would be better to address it before we transit, she said. A knowledgeable hull technician would be useful. Probably. And the 6 dinners, she said, and then stopped. 4, I said. We only did 4. Tradition actually requires 6, said Yisette, very quietly. But Sarah said that we were not going to impose a burden. Yisette, I said. She looked at me with those wide amber eyes, young and focused, and more open than any Sheth face I'd seen since Issen had told me she wanted to crew on a ship where humans were welcome. I will miss the next berth, I said. Kepler Station will have another hull contract. The thermal dampener panel needs checking, and I think we have 2 dinners left. The expression that crossed Yisette's face was the knife recognition. I could see it, clear as anything. Something cutting exactly to the truth. The Sheth cry from it, Sarah had said. She didn't cry. She just nodded with the careful dignity of someone accepting something they hadn't been sure they would be given. I will tell the captain, she said. Tell her the gate number got confusing again, I said. Yisette made the laughter sound, brief and low, the sound of something genuinely pleased with the world, and went back toward the docking corridor. And I sat back in the immigration chair and looked at the ceiling, and thought that my father would have had a great deal to say about all of this, and most of it would have been embarrassing, and all of it would have been right. The gate number had been wrong. Some things are exactly where they need to be.